When you pay the price for immortality, not only darkness but death itself awaits you.
Hello, whispered ones. Tonight, we will uncover an unknown side of the Lord of the Night. I will whisper to you the untold story of Dracula, revealing the secrets hidden behind the darkness. There is much more to him than the Dracula you know. In this story, you will witness his inner conflicts, his dark choices, and the deep truth concealed behind the curse. So relax, close your eyes, and let us embark on a journey into the unknown world of Dracula, carried by these whispers. The darkness of the night had descended upon the battlefield, a heavy mist enveloping everything. Dracula thought he was on the verge of victory. His enemies had been routed, and his army was on the cusp of triumph. Just as he believed the battle was nearly over, the cold sharpness of a sword echoed in his back. The pain of cold metal spread throughout his body. In the very moment he thought he had won, he had never been closer to death. Dracula, struggling to carry his wounded body, fell to his knees. Around him, the warriors lay lifeless on the ground, meeting the earth. As the warmth of his own blood spread through his cloak, he felt a great emptiness in his chest. With every breath, his life slipped further from his grasp. Breathing became harder, his vision blurred into the encroaching darkness. Death, with all its cold inevitability, was settling upon him. Just then, amidst the clamor of the battle, a silence spread. He felt the air growing colder, as if death had paused just for him. A shadow, like death itself, silently stepped onto the battlefield and stood before Dracula. Emerging from the shadow was a figure, far different from any human. Its eyes glowed with a blood-red light, and a dark aura swirled around it. Who are you?" Dracula asked, summoning the last of his strength. But deep down, he already knew what he faced. This being was not an ordinary enemy or warrior. In that moment, he realized that the figure before him was not human. It was a being from beyond death. The creature leaned towards him, a dark smile curling on its lips. A warrior seeking eternal life, it whispered, its voice like a blade cutting through the air. "But if you want power and immortality, are you ready to pay the price?" Even as Dracula stood face to face with the cold embrace of death, he had not lost his desire for power. "Can you save me?" he asked, his voice trembling but filled with hope. The vampire circled him slowly, continuing in a low, ominous voice. "Death may be the end for you, or it could be the beginning of eternal life. I can give you immortality, I can give you power, but everything comes with a price." Dracula's heart pounded with the desperation of a dying man. Victory, power, eternal life. He would do anything for them. "What price?" he asked. The vampire leaned in, whispering in his ear, "The price of immortality is blood. Eternal life brings eternal hunger. You will sacrifice your humanity and become the Lord of Darkness. But you will have immortality, and no one will ever make you bow." Dracula's mind fell into brief silence. If he accepted this pact, he could control his people and enemies for all eternity. But his humanity? As he was already on the verge of death, he thought he had nothing left to lose. "I want the power," he said, his eyes filled with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." The vampire slowly bent down toward Dracula's neck and sank his teeth into his skin. In the moment Dracula thought his life had ended, the last warmth in his body faded. But simultaneously, an intense surge of power erupted within him, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. He was now immortal. But it was not a gift, it was an eternal curse. When the vampire's teeth pierced Dracula's neck, he felt nothing at first. Time seemed to freeze, the sounds of battle disappearing entirely from his ears. A cold numbness quickly enveloped his body. His heart began to slow, and the fragile threads of life snapped one by one. Yet, at the brink of death, something within him started to change. Blood flowed once more through his veins, but it was no longer his own. It was being reshaped by a foreign and powerful force. When his eyes opened again, the night sky looked sharper than ever before. The stars, which he had never noticed, now glowed brilliantly, and the darkness of the night felt deep and warm. He took a deep breath, but the air did not fill his lungs. Death had brought him a new body. Dracula had been reborn, but this rebirth was far from salvation. In time, he tried to rise again, his body stronger than ever before. His wounds had healed, and all the pain he had felt had vanished. Yet, there was a hunger within him, deeper and more relentless than anything he had ever experienced. He didn't fully understand what it was, but deep down, he knew what his soul craved. The vampire stood before him once again. "Welcome to your first night of eternity," he said. "You are immortal now, but there is a price. You must quell the hunger within, or it will destroy you." Feeling the hunger inside him, Dracula began to grasp the meaning of the vampire's words. This hunger, what is it?" he asked, his voice trembling but full of curiosity. With a dark glint in his eyes, the vampire drew closer. "Human blood. You can only feed on that now. It is the price of immortality. Every night, every century, this hunger will gnaw at you. If you don't feed, it will consume you." For a moment, Dracula felt the terror rise within him. But the strength of his hunger overshadowed even his fear. He noticed one of the soldiers kneeling nearby. He was wounded, on the brink of death. The beat of his heart was faint but clear. Dracula could feel the warmth of the blood pulsing through the soldier's neck. Driven by an uncontrollable urge, he knelt beside him. In that moment, everything changed. When he sank his teeth into the soldier's neck, the hunger inside him gave way to a strange satisfaction. As the warm blood flowed down his throat, he realized that his life had been irrevocably altered. When Dracula tasted blood for the first time, he understood the curse of immortality. The hunger within him would always be there, and he would forever have to pay that price. That night, on the battlefield where he had died, he was reborn, not as a human, but as the Lord of the Night. The taste of the first blood spread through Dracula's veins like a burning fire. As the hunger within him subsided for a brief moment, he closed his eyes, savoring the pleasure brought by this new power. But that moment of victory was short-lived. From that point on, the darkness inside him began to grow stronger with every passing second. He felt himself drifting further from his humanity, but at the same time, he believed he was strong enough to wield this new power. As Dracula wandered through the castle that night, he knew he was no longer just a commander or warrior. An eternal life had been granted to him, but the price of that life was an insatiable thirst for human blood. He had claimed his first victim, and from that moment, nothing would ever be the same. He could feel a monster being born within him, yet he acted as if he still had control over that beast. Dracula looked down at his hands, the warmth of the blood slowly fading, and began to contemplate the power this had given him. The night was now his ally. The darkness fueled him, making every movement quicker, sharper. Time was no longer a threat to him. Centuries could pass, yet he would remain unchanged. But these thoughts could not suppress the deeper conflict growing inside him. A voice echoed louder in his mind with every passing minute. It was the echo of his conscience. At first, he had felt strong. After all, he had killed many of his enemies on the battlefield. But now, killing had become a mere necessity. Every person he killed was simply a resource needed to sustain his existence. While he tried to embrace this new identity, his humanity still lingered within. As the night wore on, Dracula stepped outside the castle. The cold air still carried the scent of battle. As he looked around, he saw the lifeless bodies of the soldiers who had once been loyal to him. Once a commander who defied death, he was now cursed to bear the weight of immortality. But the endless hunger inside him would only grow stronger with each passing day. He paused for a moment. Will this hunger ever end? He muttered to himself. No matter how powerful, no matter how immortal, this hunger would remain with him always. He realized he had no choice but to accept this darkness within. He was no longer human, he was now a predator. After tasting that first blood, Dracula felt as if he was floating in some kind of void. He hadn't fully grasped what had happened. His hunger had subsided for a time, but in its place came a quiet terror and a feeling of transformation he couldn't quite understand. The night no longer felt ordinary. The darkness seemed denser, the silence deeper, and the world around him appeared sharper. As he roamed the castle that night, his eyes continuously fell upon his soldiers. He could hear their breaths, almost feel the blood coursing through their veins. But instead of offering him comfort, this heightened awareness brought an unsettling realization. It was as if he was becoming a stranger to his own body. While he felt physically stronger, he was beginning to understand that something was profoundly wrong inside him. As time passed, Dracula's sleep became increasingly disturbed. At the first light of dawn, an overwhelming unease would fill him. During the day, even opening his eyes felt like an impossible task. It was as though the sunlight was his enemy, burning his skin. At first, he attributed this to the wounds he had suffered in battle. Perhaps his body had not fully healed. But with each passing day, he felt more and more changed. This process continued for weeks. The hunger inside him grew stronger each day, though he couldn't yet fully understand what it craved. Regular food no longer tasted the same, and water failed to quench his thirst. This deepened his internal turmoil. His human body was no longer enough for him, but he couldn't grasp what it was that he truly needed. Night after night, as he wandered the silent halls of the castle, he tried to make sense of the darkness within him. But nothing logical came to mind. He frequently recalled that moment on the battlefield when he had come face to face with death. The words of the dark figure echoed in his mind, though their true meaning remained elusive. It was as if what had happened that night had been a dream, but his body reminded him more forcefully with each day that it was no dream. One night, as he wandered the castle alone, a distant sound startled him. One of his soldiers had been wounded, and when the sharp scent of blood filled his nostrils, he finally understood what his hunger sought. The hunger awakened within him, but this hunger was not of a kind any human would recognize. It thirsted for blood. He refused to accept this truth before choosing his first victim. In that moment, an inner battle began. Darkness sought to consume him, while his humanity clung to resistance. But the hunger was far stronger. Weeks of turmoil had brought Dracula to the edge of exhaustion. The hunger within him grew more ferocious with each passing day, gnawing at his mind every second. He could no longer tolerate human food, and even the taste of water had become meaningless. He was becoming a stranger to his own body, and even breathing felt like a burden. He didn't know how to fill the emptiness inside him, but he had begun to sense that the answer lay in blood. The need, which he refused to acknowledge, tightened its grip on him with every night that passed. That night, a wounded soldier lay helplessly in the corner of the room. When Dracula saw the man, for the first time, he clearly recognized the true target of the hunger inside him. The soldier's breaths were shallow, his heartbeat erratic. In that moment, the sharp scent of blood filled Dracula's senses, fully awakening the beast within him. He moved, driven by an urge he had never felt before. A deep fear gripped him, but it paled in comparison to the overwhelming hunger. Slowly, he approached the wounded soldier. His mind knew what he had to do, but these thoughts felt beyond his control. Like a shadow, he leaned over the soldier. The man looked at Dracula with loyalty, his eyes reflecting the respect he held for his commander. As Dracula gazed into those eyes, he could hear the final echoes of his own conscience. But the hunger silenced everything. As he leaned toward the man's neck, for the first time, Dracula fully understood the curse that dark figure had bestowed upon him. When his teeth sank into the soldier's flesh, he felt the warmth of the blood for the first time. The hunger inside him, sated with immense satisfaction, receded as Dracula slowly withdrew. The man's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, and for a brief moment, Dracula felt victorious. His hunger had subsided, but the taste of this victory was far from what he had imagined. Blood was now a necessity for him, but for the first time, he realized the true nature of the curse. He had killed one of his own soldiers, but this was only the beginning. There would be more blood, more prey. As the weight of this reality pressed down upon him, Dracula understood that he had no choice but to embrace his new identity. That night, Dracula left his humanity behind for the first time. There was no turning back now. His final link to his human self had been severed. His emotions, his conscience, they all began to fade away. Only an endless hunger and darkness remained within him. Dracula could feel the nights growing longer. The hunger inside him was no longer just a feeling, it was becoming an all-consuming reality that took hold of his mind more and more each day. While he had unconsciously fed on blood on the battlefield, he had thought that moment was fleeting. Now, this need had transformed into a stronger and more inescapable truth with every passing night. That night, the silence within the castle felt more unsettling than ever before. As Dracula roamed the dark corridors, his eyes scanned every corner with careful attention. Though he tried to fight the ever-growing hunger within him, he was slowly beginning to accept that there would be no end to it. Still, the scent of blood continued to trigger him, whether he wanted it to or not. As he wandered through the halls, he noticed a soldier sitting in the armory, sharpening his sword. The harsh scrape of the blade on stone was painfully sharp to Dracula's heightened senses. After passing the sword over the whetstone a few more times, the soldier tested the blade's sharpness by lightly running his finger along the edge. A small cut appeared, and in that moment, something happened that captured Dracula's full attention, a single drop of blood trickled from the tiny wound. The blood slid down the soldier's finger in a thin line. Until then, Dracula had been doing his best to suppress the hunger, but that small wound reignited the hunger like a spark to dry kindling. The urge within him overwhelmed all other thoughts. This time, there was no chaos of the battlefield, no unconscious impulse. Everything was crystal clear. That drop of blood was calling to him. He moved silently toward the soldier. As the man inspected his cut, Dracula approached, his gaze fixed on the small drop of blood. He hadn't imagined that something so small could stir the beast inside him so intensely. His heart raced. All traces of his human resistance had vanished. All that remained was the primal need to survive and the relentless hunger that demanded to be satisfied. Dracula stepped closer without alerting the soldier. When the man looked up at his commander, there was a moment of confusion in his eyes, but Dracula knew exactly what he would do. This time, as his teeth sank into the soldier's neck, he was fully aware of his actions. As the taste of blood once again flowed down his throat, the hunger inside him was, for a brief moment, quelled. This was Dracula's first conscious victim. The impulse he had not understood on the battlefield had now fully revealed itself. He was leaving his humanity behind, once and for all. Though the moment had begun with a small wound, it brought about a profound change in Dracula's existence. In that instant, he accepted that suppressing his hunger was no longer an option. That small cut had brought him one step closer to completely surrendering to the darkness within him. After Dracula's first conscious experience with blood, he began to notice how the growing darkness within him was slowly taking over his life. The hunger inside him was no longer a stranger, but managing it was far from easy. Day by day, his connections with people were steadily breaking. Even his own soldiers started to appear uneasy in his presence. Approaching them felt like a threat, and in their eyes, he saw an increasing amount of fear. As the days passed, Dracula became quieter and more withdrawn. The once powerful and decisive commander whose voice echoed through the castle halls had been replaced by a silent lord who drifted through the shadows. His people began whispering that he was no longer the man he used to be. No one knew exactly what had changed, but everyone sensed that something was different. Dracula felt himself becoming more distant from humanity with each passing day. No matter how hard he tried to suppress his hunger, it was impossible to resist its pull. During the day, he locked himself away in the castle's chambers, and at night, he took long, solitary walks. Every moment spent around people only deepened the feeling of estrangement within him. He knew he no longer belonged among them. The curse he carried had begun to isolate him from society. This loneliness was not just a physical separation. Deep in his soul, he carried a darkness he could never share with anyone. The gaze of others felt like judgment. Even though no one knew what he had become, they had stopped trying to understand him. Though Dracula tried to fight against this isolation, with each passing night, he found himself descending further into the darkness. His people's trust in him was fading, and even his soldiers no longer acted comfortably around him. The servants in the castle avoided his presence, fearful of even making eye contact. Over time, Dracula retreated completely into the night, forsaking daylight altogether. Even the warmth of the sun had become a threat to him. Only the darkness of the night brought him any sense of comfort now. The nights Dracula spent in the castle began to blur together, one blending into the next like shadows. Time had almost lost its meaning for him. The commander who once meticulously planned every day, leading his soldiers with strength and precision, now wandered the dark corridors at night, trying to quell the hunger within him. But how sustainable could this existence be? Dracula felt himself drifting further and further from his humanity with each passing day. One evening, as usual, Dracula emerged from the farthest corner of the castle. His eyes wandered over the stone walls, and the emptiness inside him felt greater than ever before. There were no more soldiers or servants around him. The vast castle, once filled with life, was now utterly silent, save for the echo of Dracula's own footsteps. Yet, this night felt different. The instincts he had long tried to suppress now seemed to be guiding him. He no longer felt as if he belonged within these walls, as if even the stones of the castle were rejecting him. Dracula walked toward the castle's grand doors. Beyond them lay an endless darkness, the world outside swallowed by the night. But that world now belonged to him. Living among humans, enduring their presence, had become unbearable. Every encounter with them only fed the hunger inside him, forcing him to remember the monster he had become. He no longer wished to carry that burden. Dracula opened the heavy doors of the castle. In that moment, he knew he was on the verge of an irreversible decision. These stone walls, where he had lived for years, had once been his sanctuary, a source of strength. But now, they felt foreign to him, like a prison. He felt trapped here, and by the end of this night, he was ready to break free from his captivity. As the doors opened, the dark forest stretched before him in all its grandeur. The whispers of the trees, the murmur of the wind through the night, brought him a strange sense of peace. The forest could be his refuge, a world untouched by humans, quiet and dark. Dracula thought that there, away from people, the hunger inside him might be easier to control. At least, without their presence, he wouldn't be constantly reminded of his curse. He no longer lived like them, and in this world, there was no reason to continue living among humans. He turned back one last time. The towering stone walls of the castle looked cold and distant. Everything he had left behind within those walls was now nothing but a memory. His humanity, his loyalties, his victories, and his losses, all of it remained behind those stones. For Dracula, there was no life left here. With silent steps, he walked through the castle gates. With every step, he left behind another piece of his humanity. As he ventured into the dark depths of the forest, he knew he would never return. He was no longer the commander, the leader, or the hero of this castle. He was now simply a part of the darkness. Once a ruler of his people and his soldiers, Dracula had now surrendered to the darkness within himself. In this world, his only companion was the night, and his only sustenance was blood. That night, Dracula never returned to the castle. What remained was merely a legend, a name whispered in fear during the darkest hours of the night. He had disappeared into the endless darkness, but somehow he continued to exist as a shadow, lingering in the silence of the night. No one knew where he had gone, but his presence was always felt in the stillness of the dark. After leaving the castle, Dracula surrendered himself to the depths of the forest, into the embrace of the night. Years, perhaps even centuries, passed by. Time had lost its meaning for him. At night, as he hunted silently through the darkness, he sought ways to satisfy his hunger. But no matter how much he tried to quell it, there was always a voice deep within his conscience that troubled him. The need to kill humans weighed on him, making him restless. Over time, Dracula developed a kind of logic to cope. Hunting humans endlessly didn't fill the emptiness inside him. Instead, it only brought more regret. He began searching for ways to feel a little less burdened by the guilt that consumed him. Perhaps if he only hunted the wicked, he could silence the growing remorse in his soul, if only for a moment. As he wandered through dark streets or distant villages at night, he started seeking out criminals and cruel men. Thieves, murderers, and those who harmed the innocent became his prey. He tried to suppress his hunger by feeding on those who deserved it. Every wicked soul he claimed briefly quelled the hunger within him. But with each hunt, he realized it was never enough to quiet his conscience completely. Even as he told himself that these men deserved death, deep down, he knew it wasn't enough to justify his actions. He began to understand that this path would never bring him the peace he sought, even if he hunted only the guilty. No matter how noble his reasons seemed, he was still a monster. And no matter how just their cause, monsters remain monsters. Dracula, despite his attempts to channel his darkness into what he believed was righteous, couldn't escape the truth. He would always be burdened by the curse of what he had become. As the years slipped by, Dracula found that the pleasure he once took from life began to fade. At the start of his immortality, the thrill of power and freedom had satisfied him for a time. Yet as time marched on, everything around him seemed increasingly meaningless. The world of humans was in constant flux, new kingdoms emerged, wars were waged, but Dracula remained untouched by this cycle, as though suspended outside of it. Everything was fleeting, and yet he remained the same. Immortality, which had once gifted him the power he craved, now felt like a heavy burden. The relentless passage of time slowly started to decay Dracula from within. No matter how powerful he became or how much wealth he amassed, the emptiness inside him only grew. As he watched the lives of humans unfold, he began to notice the beauty in their fleeting existence. People died, but in that brevity, their lives gained meaning. Dracula, however, was condemned to live forever. And in time, the eternity he had once coveted had turned into a curse. During his long walks through the forest at night, Dracula became lost in his thoughts. Was there a way to escape this curse? He began to seek a way out of his immortality. Perhaps there was a way to undo the dark pact he had made. He recalled the shadowy figure with whom he had bargained for this eternal life, wondering if their agreement could be undone. Maybe death could offer him the release he so desperately sought. But no matter how much he searched, there was no simple path to ending his immortality. Vampirism was not a gift, but an unavoidable curse. In a world entirely engulfed by darkness, death had become his only hope. Yet achieving that hope was far more difficult than he had imagined. Days, nights, and seasons passed. Each new dawn brought the same darkness for Dracula. There was no new hope, no new way out. Immortality felt like a prison. His existence stretched endlessly before him with no sense of purpose. He was trapped in a life he had sustained for centuries, now seeking any way to escape it. The monster he had created within himself had become his own enemy, fighting against him as he searched for release. As Dracula chased the shadow of death, he began to accept that perhaps there was an inevitable truth: he could never give back his vampirism. Yet, this realization didn't stop him. His existence had become solely about finding a way out. He would continue searching for a way to break the pact he had made with the darkness, because immortality had brought him nothing but pain and isolation. No matter how powerful he was, everything must have an end. and Dracula was determined to find his. He had grown unable to bear the endless suffering that came with immortality. The years spent hunting evil men had only momentarily eased his conscience, but this dark life weighed heavier on him with each passing day. The chains of eternal life dragged him deeper into a loneliness from which there seemed to be no escape. What had once seemed like a reward now felt like an unbearable curse. All he desired was release from this curse, perhaps through a true death. Dracula, overwhelmed by the hunger and darkness within him, began to search for ways to end his own existence. He retreated into the forest night after night, attempting different methods. First, he believed that sunlight might burn him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he exposed his bare skin to the rays. But while each touch of sunlight weakened him and left his body covered in burns, it did not kill him. He survived, scarred and scorched, but alive. Even the sun could not end him. Next, he turned to the sharpest of weapons. Swords, spears, and daggers, all aimed at his heart. But each blow, no matter how fierce, only bounced off his immortal body. No matter how much blood he shed, his wounds healed almost instantly, and the pain vanished as quickly as it came. As he realized the impossibility of destroying himself, he sank deeper into a spiral of rage and despair, trapped in an existence with no way out. One night, as he wandered the forest, his eyes closed and opened slowly, and only the faint glow of the moon illuminated his surroundings. But in his mind, something stirred. The whispers of a dark, forgotten magic began to echo in his thoughts. It was as if a voice from ancient times was calling out to him from the shadows. This call felt like a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was another way, a darker solution. There had to be a way to end this, a way to free himself from the curse entirely. Yet, the call was vague, and only faint, whispered words offered him any clues. Driven by this mysterious promise, Dracula realized that perhaps there was something beyond what he knew, something old and dark enough to finally bring him the release he craved. But the path to it was uncertain, and the whispers offered only the barest glimpse of what lay ahead. Determined to free himself from the curse, Dracula devoted all his time to uncovering the origins of his immortality. He spent countless nights wandering through ancient tombs, abandoned monasteries, and cursed ruins, chasing the traces of forgotten civilizations and their dark histories. Everywhere he went, he found remnants of shadowy, long-lost legends, but none brought him the release he sought. Instead, they only forced him to confront the darkness within himself even more. After what felt like centuries of fruitless searching, one night, Dracula's path led him to the ruins of an old village. The place was filled with echoes of the past, and no living soul remained among the remnants of the villagers. But beneath the ruins of a crumbled church, buried in the earth, Dracula discovered an old book hidden within a crypt. The book was covered in dust, untouched for years. Its cover was made of thick, weathered leather, and its pages were brittle, threatening to fall apart. As soon as Dracula touched the book, he felt the familiar presence of the dark figure who had cursed him. It was as though this book held the answers he had been seeking for so long. Within its pages, he sensed the presence of ancient spells, rituals, and forgotten dark knowledge. Perhaps this book was the first key to his salvation. Opening the tome, Dracula found symbols and mysterious markings written in an ancient language. Every line seemed to echo in his mind like a whispered secret. The book spoke of pacts made with dark forces, of the bargains and consequences that came with immortality. Dracula's hopes rose. Could this be the path to breaking his curse? Yet, he also knew that this could mark the beginning of a greater struggle. As he delved deeper into the book, Dracula realized that this was no ordinary grimoire. It was a guide to cursed agreements, leading him into the depths of the dark forces that had trapped him. The pages described complex and dangerous rituals meant to face those dark powers head-on and reclaim what had been lost. One particular ritual caught Dracula's attention, a rite to summon a dark entity that had granted him immortality and open a portal to renegotiate the terms of their ancient pact. Dracula was ready to descend into the book's secrets. However, he knew this new knowledge could lead him down an even darker path. With every page he turned, the symbols and words reverberated within him as if they were unlocking something deeper. The book was no ordinary collection of spells, but a cursed guide, one that had been written to confront beings like the one he had made his pact with centuries ago. The rituals were not only dangerous, but also fraught with unimaginable risks. Yet one ritual stood out among the rest. It promised to open a doorway, allowing Dracula to confront the dark being once again and attempt to undo the deal that had condemned him to eternal life. Dracula felt a flicker of hope, knowing that this could be the key. But to attempt it meant facing not only the entity that had granted his immortality, but also the darkness within himself. The ritual was far from simple. Dracula needed to offer his blood, pledge his allegiance with an ancient vow, and summon the dark figure once again. He was determined to face this shadowy entity, as there were no other paths left for him. When night fell, Dracula ventured deep into the forest, as instructed by the book. At the darkest moment of the night, when even the moonlight had withdrawn from the woods, he created the ritual circle as described in the text. He let his own blood drip into the circle, reciting the dark words aloud. Each word sliced through the silence of the night like a blade. The air around him grew heavy, the stillness thickened, and the temperature dropped. And then, from the shadows, the dark figure emerged once more. Dracula's heart stirred with mixed emotions. Facing the figure again was as terrifying as it had been the first time. But this time, he was resolute. He was prepared to do whatever it took to rid himself of the curse of immortality. The figure approached with a mocking smile. "Back again, are we?" it said, its voice like a whisper cutting through the darkness. "Grown tired of eternal life?" Dracula stepped forward and spoke with determination. "I want to reverse this curse. Immortality has become a burden. Undo our pact." The figure circled Dracula slowly, a cunning gleam in its eyes. "Ah, but agreements are not so easily broken," it replied. "I told you this before. However, this time, I see your courage and resolve. Perhaps there is a way, but it won't come without a price." Dracula took a deep breath. He had known there would be a cost. "What do you want?" he asked. The figure paused for a moment, then spoke, its voice cold like the wind from the abyss. "To break this curse, I will give you a task. This task is the only way to reclaim your mortality. But it will not be a simple one. It will test your courage, your sacrifice, and your darkest desires." Dracula, impatient, stared into the figure's eyes. "What is this task?" he demanded. The dark figure locked eyes with Dracula, its voice deep and resonant, like a whisper echoing through the void. "You wish to be free from your endless torment? Then listen closely. You must sacrifice the purest, most innocent soul. A child's innocence, a mother's love, or the life of the most defenseless creature. Only their blood can break this curse. That is the price of your freedom, Dracula. Make your choice. Dracula's eyes widened. The weight of the task sank into him. The cost of freedom was a cruel and unspeakable price, one that would force him to confront the darkest parts of his soul. The ultimate decision lay before him, to claim his freedom through a sacrifice that would forever stain his soul or continue bearing the chains of his cursed immortality. As Dracula heard the dark figure's words, time seemed to stand still. The figure's mocking smile lingered, but inside, Dracula felt frozen. The idea of sacrificing an innocent soul, it was a far heavier burden than he had anticipated. No matter how much of his humanity he had lost, ending the life of an innocent would strip away whatever remnants of his conscience remained. The dark figure noticed the hesitation on Dracula's face and grinned wider. "Not a hard choice, is it?" it said. "To rid yourself of eternal life, all you have to do is sacrifice one innocent life. It's that simple." But to Dracula, the task was anything but simple. He had spent years trying to soothe his conscience, hunting evil men to lessen the weight of his curse. And now, he was confronted with something entirely different. Could he really end an innocent life to escape immortality? Or would he continue living with the curse forever? Both choices led to immense suffering. Avoiding the figure's gaze, Dracula stepped back slowly. Without saying a word, he bowed his head and turned away, walking back into the forest. This was not a decision he could make quickly. He needed time to think, to understand the gravity of his next move. Once the choice was made, there would be no turning back. For many nights, Dracula wrestled with his inner conflict. He encountered innocent people wherever he traveled, through villages, towns, and along forest paths. Their lives, so simple yet so full of beauty, tugged at something deep within him. A child's laughter, a mother's love, the wisdom of an old man, these lives, though brief, were filled with meaning. To end one of them, just to save himself, felt like an unbearable price. But the weight of the curse pressed down on him more heavily with each passing day. Every night, the dark figure's words echoed in his mind, just one innocent. One soul, and you will be free. He woke up with those words and fell into restless thoughts every night, consumed by them. One morning, in a dreary village, Dracula once again heard the sound of a child's laughter. A little girl was playing, her eyes filled with innocence and joy. As Dracula watched her, a deep sorrow stirred within him. Perhaps she was the purest embodiment of innocence he had ever seen. Could her life be sacrificed for his freedom? He felt a painful stirring inside. This task had become a battle between his desire for freedom and his waning humanity. As he stood there, torn between his desire to be free and the moral horror of the task at hand, Dracula realized that this was not just a test of his will, it was a test of his very soul. Would he allow the monster within him to claim its darkest victory? Or would he continue bearing the curse, refusing to sacrifice the last vestiges of his humanity? The choice before him was both a path to liberation and a descent into the deepest abyss of his conscience. Dracula stood frozen in place, his mind torn between two impossible choices. As the little girl played, blissfully unaware of the world's darkness, her laughter echoed through the empty streets. Her eyes, so full of innocence and joy, pierced through Dracula's soul. The dark figure's whispered words echoed in his mind once more, freedom comes at the cost of an innocent soul's blood. Every part of him screamed in conflict. Sacrificing such purity for his own liberation? Could he truly snuff out a life so full of light just to save himself from the curse he had borne for centuries? His heart, weighed down by centuries of torment, clashed violently with the last shreds of his humanity. The girl, without knowing, wandered closer to Dracula. Her steps light, her face glowing with the simple joy of existence. Dracula, struggling against the inner darkness that had consumed him for so long, clenched his fists. His mind raced. One more step, one more moment, and he could be free, but at what cost? The dark figure's voice filled his mind again, taunting him, "One innocent soul, and you will be free. Just one. If you can't do it, you will carry this curse forever." Dracula's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He was standing on the edge of an abyss. He knew that one more step would seal his fate forever. His eyes, still fixed on the girl's bright, innocent face, flickered with deep conflict. To take her life would end his suffering, but it would also obliterate the last vestige of his humanity. The girl continued to laugh, spinning around in a carefree dance. She had no idea of the darkness that hovered so close to her. Dracula felt his own heart breaking at the thought of what he was about to do. How could he, once a proud leader, a man of honor, stoop to this? To take the life of a child, so pure, so untouched by the world's evils, just to free himself? He took one step closer. His mind screamed at him to stop, but the curse's weight pulled him forward. The dark figure's voice grew louder in his head, urging him on, pushing him to make the final choice. And then, just as his trembling hand began to reach toward the girl, he stopped. In that moment, something inside him shifted. A cold realization washed over him. If he killed this innocent, he would be no better than the monster the world feared. Freedom bought at the cost of such innocence wasn't freedom at all. It was another chain, another curse, one that would imprison his soul forever. Dracula took a deep breath and stepped back. His body trembled as he forced his hand down. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. The price was too high. Tears filled his eyes as he turned away, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. The curse of immortality would remain, but he had chosen to keep the last fragment of his humanity intact. As he walked away, the dark figure's mocking laughter echoed in his mind, but Dracula knew the truth. He would carry the burden of his curse forever, but he would not let it destroy the final part of his soul. He chose to remain a cursed being, but not a monster. Dracula took another step, but it wasn't toward salvation, it was toward the edge of an inner abyss. The girl's joy and innocence stood before him, while the weight of the darkness inside him crushed him under its burden. With every breath, he felt the chains of the curse tightening around him. For years, he had sought ways to silence his conscience, but now it demanded that he make the hardest decision of his life. His eyes remained fixed on the girl. One more step. Her innocence could be his doorway to freedom, but it would be a door stained with blood. The darkness that had consumed him for so long whispered insidiously, "What's one more life? You've killed so many evildoers. Why not one innocent?" But this was different. Sacrificing an innocent soul wouldn't just make him a monster, it would cast him onto a path from which there would be no return. The last vestiges of his humanity would be obliterated. Inside Dracula, a silent scream erupted, deep and agonizing. If he killed the girl, his soul would merge completely with the darkness. But if he didn't, the curse of immortality would continue to consume him day by day until nothing remained but endless suffering. The little girl, oblivious to the storm raging within Dracula, smiled up at him, her eyes full of innocent wonder. In that instant, Dracula's internal battle reached its peak. The girl's pure smile brought his conscience crashing to the surface. He closed his eyes for a moment, and inside his mind, two voices clashed violently. One was the dark figure's relentless whisper, "Her blood will set you free." The other was his own conscience, an echo from the depths, "Killing an innocent will destroy you forever." Dracula clenched his eyes shut, his teeth grinding together as his hands shook. Never before had he felt so utterly helpless. With each breath, the weight of the decision pressed harder against him. He took one more step. Now, only a breath separated him from the girl. But at that moment, something within him stopped him. In her gaze, he saw a reflection of his own past. Once, long ago, he had been just as innocent, just as pure. That last fragment of his humanity stirred deep within him, whispering from the darkness of his soul. If he killed this girl, there would be nothing left of who he had once been. For a moment, everything around him froze. Time seemed to stand still. And in that stillness, Dracula made a decision with every fiber of his being. He stepped back. His body trembled as he retreated, pulling himself away from the edge of an unspeakable act. The dark figure's taunts echoed in his mind, but Dracula knew the truth now. Freedom bought with innocence was no freedom at all. He could not, would not, sacrifice the girl to save himself. Dracula turned and disappeared into the shadows of the night, his curse still with him, but his soul intact. Despite all the internal conflict, Dracula could no longer resist the pull of the darkness. He looked at the little girl's innocent face one last time. Her pure, unblemished soul was his key to freedom. The dark figure's words echoed in his mind like a relentless drum, "The blood of an innocent will set you free." Dracula took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Silencing the final cries of his conscience, he reached out his arms. At that moment, the darkness within him fully took control. Before the girl could comprehend what was happening, Dracula's cold hands wrapped around her neck. As he wiped away a single tear that fell from his eye, he sank his teeth into her tender skin. The warmth of her blood flowed down his throat, and the hunger inside him melted into deep satisfaction. When he gazed at the girl's lifeless body, a profound emptiness consumed him. Her innocent blood had freed him from the curse, but the price of that freedom was far heavier than he had anticipated. The centuries-old curse that had flowed through Dracula's veins was now beginning to fade. But this was no simple liberation. What he felt within him was the unmistakable sign of his return to mortality. The dark figure approached, circling Dracula with slow, deliberate steps. "You sacrificed an innocent soul, Dracula. The chains of your curse are breaking. But this freedom is not what you imagined." The figure's voice was cold and echoing. "You are no longer immortal. Death will come for you, just like it does for every mortal." Dracula could feel the change taking hold of his body. The power of immortality, which had sustained him for centuries, was slipping away. The once invincible strength he had known was now waning, replaced by the weight of human fragility. For the first time in an eternity, he felt something he had long forgotten, the fear of death. "You are free now, Dracula," the dark figure said, its voice laced with mocking tones. No longer the Lord of the Night, just a man. Death will soon come knocking at your door. Dracula, suppressing the rising fear within him, looked down at his weakening body. He was no longer immortal. The curse had been broken, and he was now a mortal man. The girl's blood had granted him the freedom he had desired, but with that freedom came the inevitable reality of death. Life was once again finite for him. As the weight of mortality settled over him, Dracula realized that while he had escaped the curse, he had also traded it for a new fate, a fate every human must face. Death was now waiting for him, and his return to the mortal world meant that, sooner or later, it would claim him. Dracula, all ended dis reinem user in coctu. Nefessori durin lesti, usilar boyanka hisset metagi insani zea flit benini sardi. Arctic sansis giusi yactu, sedis per incident zea flaclari vardi. Olumlu almanin vertigi gurlik, oniyanidin yasamin kirogan lagila yes usikitter misti. Sanunda, Dracula, Monsur Berkizi Feta Ederic Laintind in Kurtlemus, Almiliage Jerryton Mustu. Fakad bu Kurtulus, Onajursek Osgulugutermis Mighty? Belki de Sedis per Baska Tur Tutsaklikla Yezels Mexorandidi, Kindi Victinila. Akayanin son and a Geldic, whispered once. Draculanin Koranlik Dinisandaki Yalkulugamas Baradas Sona Arier, AMA Jessen and Facilitari Asla Suzmas. Bursin Rocky Bulasmas Da, Yeni Surler V. Darenlert Siklinin Baska Hike Yellow Yanit and Carcinese de Alakajam. Cindy, Gosler and Easy Capit and BEBU Sislagent Ison Din Linen. Tavli Reeler, whispered once.